All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let me begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Dovi and Nina Elman, for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of their daughter Ayelet becoming a bas mitzvah. May she continue to be a source of nachas for the entire mishpacha. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Moshe and Dvorah Wordesheim, in memory of Moshe's mother, Liba Bas Zusha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama has an aliyah and the family in the chama. With that, let us begin a great daf ahead of us today. So today's daf is Nun Gimel 53. We are picking up a lot to do today, and I started late, which is not good. We are picking up on 52b. Not enough time. Maybe we'll start at 5. I'll take a poll. Good. So the Gemara says as follows. So we'll say we're picking up Nun Beis 52b. We're picking up at Rabbi Eloi Katz Kafni Aisa. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. So Rabbi Eloi cuts kafanaisa the shvius. So we'll say Rabbi Eloi cut down a date palm tree. A date palm, Rashi says, if you think it's the first of the widest lines of Rashi, cuts kafanaisa the shvius, dakel ta'un kafnios, ve'tmarim kitanim shelo bishlu, ve'katzatz hadakel la'etzim, ve'hefsid kafnos. So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. So Rabbi Eloi cut down a date palm. This is all Shemitah year. Cut down a date palm on Shemitah, and at that, when he cut down the date palm only had unripened dates on it. So why is he cutting down the date palm? Obviously not for the dates, because the dates ultimately, again, are unripened, but rather he cut it down to use the tree as firewood, or as wood for something. So the Gemara says, Heichi Ovid Haki, how is he allowed to do this? The Pasuk says, Li achlo amarachmana, below the hefsid. Both said the only thing you're allowed to do with produce and trees on Shemitah is consume it. You can't destroy it. So how was he able to go ahead? How was he able to go ahead and cut down the tree? So I'll say, remember, the real issue over here is the assumption that when he cut down the tree essentially, the unripened dates were wasted. In other words, they never had the chance to mature on the tree, and therefore they were pretty much inedible. So he essentially destroyed Shemitah produce. So how are you allowed to do such a thing like this? So maybe you'll say the only time that it's prohibited to destroy Shemitah produce is when the fruit fully developed. But maybe with underdeveloped fruit, which essentially are not really fruit to begin with, there is no issue of destruction. In other words, I can't destroy edible produce, but I can destroy inedible produce because that's not really considered like produce. And therefore, again, in this case, he cut down a tree with underdeveloped dates, and therefore there's no issue. I'm sorry. But is that true? Is that true? So the Gemara is positing that maybe underdeveloped produce doesn't have the status of peros, doesn't have the status of produce, of fruits. And therefore, if it doesn't have the status of fruits, there's no issue with destroying them during Shemitah. So is that true? Both say these maschali da'arla. Now Rashi points out over here that maschali da'arla shomer hagadol sivos hatmarim. This is some type of shell or husk that grows around dates. So we'll say, so this maschali deperi, this shell or this husk that grows around the dates of arla, asiri, it's treated like arla. Hoil v'na'asu shomer lepri. V'shomer lepri, so the Gemara says, since it becomes something that guards the fruit, therefore, by definition, it becomes part of the fruit itself. Now, v'shomer leperi emes habi, when does the date have this husk or have this shell? Bekufri, when it's underdeveloped, when it's in its young stages. V'ika karle piri, and yet it's still called a fruit. So we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that even an underdeveloped fruit is still called a fruit. If that's the case, once again, how is Rabbi Eloi able to cut down a palm tree with underdeveloped dates that are now no longer going to mature and going to be destroyed? How is he allowed to do that? To which the Gemara says, Rav Nachman Rabbi Yossi. Rav Nachman holds like Rabbi Yossi. Dislan Rabbi Yossi Omer, Smadar Osir Mipnei Shehu Pri, Upalig Rabbanon Alei. So we'll say, so perhaps again, this is actually subject to Machlokas. Rabbi Yossi holds that Smadar. We'll say Smadar, as we're going to see, is when the fruit is beginning to mature. Right, the beginning of the maturation of the fruit. Rabbi Yossi holds that even smadar ultimately has a status of a pri. The Rabbanon disagree. So therefore I will say, it turns out that interestingly enough, there's a fundamental machlokas as to when does a fruit become a fruit. At what point in time is a pre reckoned as a pre? Is it when maturation of the fruit begins, or is it only a pre perhaps when it becomes fully developed? I says the Gemara Maskif Rav Sim in Arda Umi Palig Rabbanon Alei Rabbi Yossi B'Shari Lanos. So do the Rabbanon argue on Rabbi Yossi? In other words, but perhaps the Machlokes Rabbi Yossi and Rabbanon is only in the case of dates. Do the Rabbanon argue on Rabbi Yossi with other trees as well? V'hotinan we learned. Meimasayin Kotis and Asay Lanos B'Shvius. At what point in time is it prohibited to cut down trees during the Shemitah year? So Beishamai says, Kol ha'ilonos m'shiyotziu. So Beishamai says, this is very interesting, we'll say, as soon as the trees begin to develop leaves, you are not permitted to go and cut them down. Rashi says over here, that's in the beginning of Nisan. Beis Hillel omrim hacharuvim mishiyishreshu. Beis Hillel says like this, it depends, we're talking about fruit trees, I will say. So it depends. Beis Hillel says, pretty much, it's when the fruit trees begin to develop fruits. So for example, charuvim, right, which is carob trees, mishiyashreshu. Ultimately, when they begin to form chains. So we'll say this means ultimately when the carobs begin to develop in ways that they look like they're interlinked. V'hagifanim and vines, top of Nun Gimel. Misheyigra'u. When ultimately, again, the grapes, we're going to see what this means, is they begin to bud. Right? You can begin to see a little grapeola that's growing on the vine over there. V'azisim, and ultimately olives, misheyanitsu. So Rashi points out over here, Mishiyagdil Hanetz Alein V'hukein Maschali. So we'll say, so by the olives, when they begin to form an outer husk and outer shell, also beginning of maturation. Ushar Kali Ilanos, but every other tree, Mishiyotziu. As soon as they begin to bring forth fruit, even in an underdeveloped state, they have the status of a pre. And halacha l'maisa, you cannot go ahead and cut down those trees on a Shemitah year. So also, interestingly enough, the Gemara says as follows. So therefore, the Gemara says over here that you see that the Rabbanan argue on, the Rabbanan agree with Rabbi Yossi by Shari Lanos. Microphone? It's. I think there's a volume setting issue because if I keep it on my shirt, it goes into the red in YouTube. That's why I'm keeping it over here. Is that good? I can put it on if you want. All right. So the Gemara says as follows: V'amrav Asi, hu bosar, hu girua, hu pol halavan. And Rav Asi says, ultimately again, this status is bosar, girua, pul halavan. I will say this is what we call this early state of maturation is called bosar. Girua, and I will say, pul halavan literally means white lentil. White lentil. So the Gemara says, pul halavan sakadaitcha. Do you really think ultimately, again, it's an actual white lentil? Does that make sense? Ela ema shiuro kipul halavan. Rather say that the shear, the amount or the size, ultimately again is like a white lentil. So the idea being is, we begin to see that although there's some specificity, maybe by the carobs or by grapes or by olives, in general, again, when it comes to fruit is considered fruit once it reaches some basic level of maturation. Or I should say maturation, of development, of initial development. So the Gemara says, Man shamus leidamar boser in smadarlo. Who is the opinion who says that it's only bosar, which Abosar is a more advanced level of maturation. Only bosar is considered to be a pre, but smadar is not. Rabbanon vikatani shar kalilanos mishiyotziu, and yet the Rabbanon themselves say that halacha l'maisa, all other fruit trees are going to be, or all the fruits are considered to be peros as soon as they bud on the tree. So therefore, Abosar, remember again, let's keep focused over here. Why are we in this sugya? We're in this sugya because Rabbi Eli cut down a palm tree with underdeveloped dates on Shemitah. Is that not a problem of destroying Shemitah produce? So he wanted to suggest that maybe Rabbi Eli is aligning himself with the opinion that says that halacha l'maisa, an item is only considered to be a pre once it is fully developed. But if it's underdeveloped, it's not a pre. We've shown that that's incorrect. that pretty much almost everyone agrees that once the fruit begins to develop on the tree, it has the status of a pri. It has the status of a fruit. To which the Gemara said, therefore, again, how does Rabbi Eloi have the right to go ahead and cut down the tree? Ella Rabbi Eloi bidinis chonikat. So we'll say this is incredible. Rabbi Eloi cut down a male palm tree. This is great, by the way. You know, the male palm tree, he never matures. It's a problem. It's a problem. Just never grows up. So therefore, Rabbi said, listen to this. A male palm tree is unable to bring its dates to full maturity. So what do you do with a male palm tree? You pluck the immature dates or the unripened dates, and they would put them in, she points out, they would put them in baskets made of palm leaves. And so the dates would mature off the tree. So Rabbi will say, interestingly enough, Rabbi Eloi was not causing the loss of the dates. These dates were coming off the tree regardless, in their immature state, because the male palm tree, I guess, lacks the vitality to bring them to proper maturity. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Eloi, in fact, did not do anything wrong. Incredible. So we'll say a little bit more Shemitah till we get to the Mishnah. So Tan Rabbanan, ochlin ba'andavim ad shichlu dalio shel ochel. So remember again, we saw yesterday, when it gets to the halachas of beer, right? So beer says that you are allowed to go ahead and maintain Shemitah produce in your home as long as it is readily available for the chayis, for the non-domestic animals out in the field. And we discussed that this is very much a regional halacha, right? That Eretz Yisrael is divided up into three areas, right? There's Yehuda, there's Galil, and there's Ever LeYarden. And in each of those three areas, there are three different chalokim, three different parts to each of those lands. And essentially, as long as a particular type of produce is available in your region, halacha l'mais, you are permitted to go ahead and maintain it in your home. So the Gemara just gives examples of this. So Tan Rabbanon, ochlin ba'anavim ad shichlu dalios shel ochel. We'll say in this case, ochel is the name of a place. You could go ahead and eat grapes. When it says eat grapes, we'll say what it means is you could eat. There's no problem eating. It means maintaining it in your home. So you could go ahead and eat grapes until ultimately, again, there are no longer any vines bearing grapes in Uchal. That was the name of the place. And if it happens to be, again, that there's grapes available in another place, great. So you could keep olives in your home until the last olives are no longer available in Tekoa, the city of Tekoa. Rabbi Eliezer Omer ad shichla acharon shel gush chalav. Rabbi Eliezer says no until the last olives are available in gush chalav. We'll say, what does it mean there are no olives available? That if a poor person were going out looking for olives, that halacha l'maisa, he would not be able to gather a rova, which is a very small measurement of olives in the trees or in the surrounding areas. We'll say, again, these are all just illustrations of the same concept. You could maintain Shemitah produce in your home as long as that Shemitah produce is available somewhere outside for the chayis, for non-domestic animal consumption. Ochlin bigrogeres at shichlu pagi beishini. You could go and eat dried figs or keep dried figs in your home until there are no longer any dried figs or figs available in Beishini. Amr Yehuda lo huskuru pagi Beishini elele inyan meiser. Disnan pagi Beishini. So ultimately, again, the Gemara says the truth is the figs of Beishini were actually only mentioned for Meiser purposes. Well, so if you look at Rashi says over here, Pagi Beishini Teinim shall also makom lo huskru bebeis hamedrash shlichashev peri ela lemeiser. So the Gemara says va'ahini ditovina chayavin b'meiser, because we learned again in the Mishnah that the dates of tovina are chayiv in meiser. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says ochlin b'tmar ma'at shichla achron shabbat. Similarly, again, going back to Shemitah now, you could go ahead and keep dates in your home until the last dates are available in the city of Tzoar. Rabbi Shimon Omer ochlin al shel bein hakipin ve'in ochlin al shel bein hashitzin. So we saw this in yesterday's daf. Rabbi Shimon said again, dates often fall off the tree, and the dates fall into two places. Sometimes they fall amongst the branches, and at other times they fall into the thorns. There are thorns that surround the base of the palm tree. So dates are considered available, quote unquote, when they are available in the branches. But if the only dates available are the dates that fell into the thorns, that's not called available. So the Gemara says, or minhi ochlin ba'navim ada Pesach. You could eat grapes until Pesach. It's all Shemitah. So when can you store grapes in your home? Up until Pesach. Because apparently, again, up until Pesach, grapes are available in the field. Past Pesach, they're not available in the field. Bezesim ad ha'atzeres. You could go ahead and keep olives in your home up until Shavuos, because that's when they're available in the field. After Shavuos, again, you have to do beer. Big rogeres ad Chanukah. You could go ahead and keep dried figs in your home until Chanukah. Bitmarim ad Purim, for dates until Purim. V'amra bibi Rabbi Yochanan, so the Gemara says, V'amra bibi Rabbi Yochanan tarti basrai samachlev. Rabbi Bibi said that Rabbi Yochanan just switched around. He switched around, ultimately, again, grogros and tamarim. Fine. So the Gemara says, V'idi. So Rose, so what's the problem? The problem just is, 1 second. We just said above that halacha l'maisa, when can you maintain different types of fruits in your home until? When can you maintain it? Until it's available. And yet here the Brisa seems to link it to the calendar, right? You could keep this item until Pesach, this item until Shavuos, this Pesach until Chanukah. So which one is it? To which the Gemara says, it's not a contradiction. The Gemara says, Idi v'idi chat shiur. In fact, it's the same shear. So we'll say, beforehand, the Gemara was just telling us, by the way, you could go ahead and you could keep grapes in your home until it's available in Uchal, right? Or in Achol, right? So now the Gemara is just telling us, by the way, that's until Pesach time. This is until Shavuos time. This is until Chanukah. It's the same shear, just here the Brisa is framing it in the calendar, whereas beforehand the Brisa was framing it in the realm of geography or availability in different cities. But it's the same exact shear. By same, I'll say first wide line, Nun Gimel and Aleph. The other possibility is Hakatani behedja, V'bay sema, Hakatani behedja, Im yeshem ucheres mehen ochlin alehen. So I'll say ultimately, again, we say it explicitly later on. Obviously, if there are any places that are later on, in other words, we'll say, if technically speaking, you find a place in which grapes or any type of produce is available later than either the Yamim Tovim or than the places mentioned beforehand, you could continue to eat as long as it is available somewhere. So we'll say, so halacha l'maisa, what comes out is just the simple halachas of beer. Beer says that you are allowed to go ahead and maintain Shemitah produce in your home as long as it is available outside for, quote-unquote, the chayis, for the animals. In other words, as long as it is available for non-domestic animals in the outdoors, you are permitted to keep it in your home. The idea is it doesn't have to be available in your city, right? Remember, again, as you saw yesterday, as long as it's available somewhere in your region, that's enough to constitute availability, and that will give you the ability to store the produce inside of your home. But once, of course, it is no longer available, the concept of beer says that what? You must take any Shemitah food items that you have stored in your home, and you must make it hefker. Once machlokes, you have to destroy it or make it hefker. We'll go with the hefker approach. You take it out of your home and you make it ownerless. Good. Tanya, Shimon Liel Omer, similar harim milan. Both says a very interesting Gemara. Shimon Liel says the simon for mountains. Now, both this is very interesting. How do you know something is called a mountain? In other words, the sign of a mountain, the topographical sign for a mountain, are milin. Rashi says milin are golnut trees. Golnut trees grow on mountains. Simin la'amakim dikalim. Ultimately, again, the sign of valleys are date palms. Date palms grow in valleys. Simin le'nechalim kanim. The sign, the simin ultimately again of a stream are reeds. We'll see what this means in just a moment. Simin l'shvela. The simin for a plain, right? A plain is shikma, are sycamore trees. And even though there's no raya for this, zeicha l'davar. Ultimately, again, there's a scriptural allusion. What scriptural allusion? Shneimar, vayitir hamelech es hakesef b'Yerushalayim. So the king gave money in Yerushalayim, the Shlomo HaMelech, the incredible wealth. Ke'avonim. He dispensed money like it was stones. Ve'es ha'arozim nasan kishkamim. He gave out cedar wood like it was sycamore wood, asher b'shvei l'rov. He gave out cedar wood, which is obviously more expensive, like it was a sycamore in the plain. So you see over here that sycamore trees are commonly found in plains. Okay, so let's analyze this. Similar haramilin, so the sign ultimately again of a mountain is walnut trees. Similar amokim dekalim, the sign of a valley, are date palms. Nafkamina lebikurim. They both say this has an important nafkamina for bikurim. Both say it's actually very important. What fruits do you go ahead and bring? Remember, for bikurim, first fruits, you only come from shivas haminim. So, for example, dates, of course, are one of the shivas haminim. But so, right, remember again how are dates one of the shivas haminim? Because when the Torah speaks about dvash, when it calls Eretz Zeis Chalav Udvash, so dvash is not bee honey, right? Dvash of Eretz Yisrael is date honey. So dates are one of the shivas haminim. So watch this. Disnan ein mavrin bikurim elam shivas haminim. We only bring bikurim from the 7 species that Eretz Yisrael is blessed with. Watch this. Velomi pero shebaharim. Velomi dikam sharim. Sorry, you don't bring bikurim from dates which grow on the mountains. Velomi peros sheba'amakim. Nor from fruit trees that grow ultimately again in the valleys. Now we'll say this is incredible. Now, I shouldn't say fruit trees. I should say fruit. We'll say, what does this mean? Date palms are only really produce good dates when the date palms grow in the valleys. So we'll say why? Because think about this. In valleys, Rashi points out, the water pools. So because the water pools, therefore again, you have good, strong, healthy dates. Masha'inkin, if you have a date palm that grows on the mountain, that's not going to be very good dates. Why? Because again, remember, water slides off the mountains. So therefore, you only bring bikurim from proper fruits. So only from dates which grow in valleys. Similarly, if you have wheat that grows in valleys, you do not bring bikurim from that wheat. Why not? Because Rashi points out over here, pooling water is not good for grain. Right? Pooling water causes grain to rot. So because of that, any grain that grows in the valley, you do not use for bikurim. So this is actually a very interesting halacha. So remember, yes, bikurim comes from shivas haminim, but bikurim only comes from proper shivas haminim. What's proper shivas haminim? Shivas haminim that grew in a way that it was supposed to grow. That's why these halachas are important. So the Gemara is telling us, by the way, where do date palms, quote unquote, supposed to grow? In the valley. Right? Ultimately, again, what's not supposed to grow in the valley? Wheat, or I should say grain. Grain, good. So the Gemara says weiter. Similar nachalim kanim, a sign of a stream. Ultimately, again, as reads. What does that mean? Nafkamina lenachal isan. Rabbi say, why is this important? Egla rufa. This is incredible. Rabbi remember again, egla rufa. You go ahead and you find a person murdered in between 2 cities. You don't know who murdered him. We measure the closest city. Ultimately, again, the elders of that city come out and they do this whole process of the decapitated calf. The Torah tells us that where does the process have to occur? By Nachal Isan. So it's interesting, there's a little bit of discussion exactly what Nachal Isan means. For right now, we'll just translate it as a flowing stream. So the Gemara says, what constitutes a stream? So a stream, by definition, is somewhere where there are reeds which are growing. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, if you were to do egla arufa chas v'shalom, so you'd have to do it in an area, ultimately, again, which possessed reeds. Incredible. Simon l'shvela shikma, the simon, ultimately, again, of a plain is a sycamore tree. So listen to this. So the Gemara says, nafkamina lemekach umemkar. Oh, this has an interesting nafkamina, we'll say, for business purposes. We'll say, what does this mean? I go over to Ruvain, and I go into contract to Ruvain to buy a plane, right? To buy a shvela. I will say what happens. I go ahead, and again, I've never seen the property. He described it, I never see the property. I buy it, I get there, I see, and what is it lacking? It has no sycamore trees. I will say I have the ability to claim mekachtos. I have the ability to claim this was a mistaken sale. Because everyone knows that a plane, part of the definition of a plane is that it possesses sycamore trees. So I will say this is incredibly important, to which the Gemara says, well, now that you said this, Hashta da asis lahachi kulhu nami lemekachu memkar. The truth is, the ramifications of all of these statements, when you're defining what grows on these different areas, all of this could have a significant business ramification. Because I will say, the same idea. If I buy a mountain, if I buy a valley, right? A valley by definition has date palms, right? I buy a mountain, right? A mountain by definition, what did the mountain have? Milan had walnut trees, right? So we'll say, so again, so this is actually very interesting because we'll say from a real estate perspective, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is whenever you purchase any of these types of lands, we assume that these lands have this type of, I'll call it vegetation, which is probably the wrong word, but you understand what I mean. These type of growths are vegetation. And if it lacks this type of vegetation or growth, then Einach Hinami, perhaps that might be a voidable omission, right? Or I should say, might be a voidable reality, that I could void the transaction based on the lack of these items. All right, quite interesting. But let's say, here we go. Fascinating Mishnah. Makom shenagu limkar behema daka lenachar mochrin. If you live in a place, we'll say, still we're talking about the minhag, being hagim now. If you live in a place where it is customary to sell small animals to Gentiles, you are permitted to do so. Makom shelo nagu limkar mochrin. But if you live in a place where they don't go ahead and sell small animals to Gentiles, you can't do so. We'll see what the issue is in just a moment. Buchol makom in mochron behema gasa. We'll say, but wherever you live, we do not sell behema gasa, large animals. Or we'll say, large animals are beasts of burden. Beasts of burden. We do not sell beasts of burden to Gentiles. Now we'll say, what's the issue with selling a behema gasa to a nachri? So look at Rashi for just a moment. I'm in there, it's in the widest lines of Rashi, about 6 lines in. Tegazer be'rabanan mishum she'ila umishum schirus umishum nisyoni b'mesachas avodah zarah v'yisrael mitzav al shisa v'drabashah. Listen to this. This is incredible. Chazal were concerned about the following: that if we allow you to sell beasts of burden to a Gentile, you may easily come to enter into rental agreements regarding those types of animals. Well, here's the problem. The problem is a Jew is not permitted to rent his animal to a nachri over Shabbos. Why not? Because my animals have to rest on Shabbos as well. So, for example, on a technical level, I could rent to a nachri from a Sunday through a Friday. That's not a problem. But Chazal often these types of rental agreements were for longer periods of time. And if I rent my animal to a nachri and he ends up working that animal on Shabbos, I am in violation. That is an Isra Da'araisa. So Chazal therefore said you can't go ahead and rent an animal to a nachri. But in order to safeguard that, Chazal also said you can't sell a behema gasa, beast of burden, to a nachri, because we're concerned once sales are permitted, it's only a matter of time until what? Until people begin renting these animals as well. Remember, I want to point out, a sale, what's technically speaking, should it be permitted to sell an animal to a nachri? Yeah, it's not. Once I sell it, it's not mine. Who cares? But the concern are rentals. And we're concerned that if we allow you ultimately, again, to sell, you may come to rent as well. That's the concern. So I will say, the Gemara is therefore saying, so some communities, as an additional chumrah, said you can't even rent non-beasts of burden. I know it's not a good term. What we call it behemadaka, small animals. You can't even go ahead and rent small animals, or for that matter, sell small animals to a nachri, again, as a way of safeguarding the gzeira against beasts of burden. So again, that's minhag hamakom. If you live in a place where they don't sell behemadakas, can't sell behemadakas. You live in a place where they do sell behemadakas, you can sell behemadakas. However, again, in any place we do not sell beasts of burden. Examples: agalim, syachin, shleimin, shvurin. Again, whether that's calves or foals, whether they are complete or whether they are maimed, right? Shover means broken or maimed. So I will say, interestingly enough, you might have thought, well, if an animal is maimed and it can't really be a beast of burden, then halach l'maisa it should be permitted. Kamash malon, it is not permitted under any circumstance. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'shvura. Rabbi Yehuda says you can sell a maimed animal. That's not a problem, because we'll say since that's not really capable of work, it's not a beast of burden. It's no problem to go ahead and sell it. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'shvura. Ben Besera matir b'sus. Very interesting. Ben Besera says you could sell horses to an achar. We'll say why? Because horses, interestingly enough, were not used as beasts of burden. Ultimately, again, they were used just for riding purposes. Rashi says over here, Ben Besera matir b'sus, b'fisha malachto l'rechiva, unisune didei leka l'migzar bahen de'in ban ela mishum shvus, de'nochal ga behema ga b'shvus. It's very interesting. Why don't we ride an animal on Shabbos? We'll say, why can't I ride my horse to shul on Shabbos? So again, we'll say it's nothing to do with working the animal. It has to do ultimately again that I might break off a branch, right, to go ahead and use as a whip for the animal. So interestingly enough, so based on this, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseirus said that you're allowed to sell horses. So Rabbi says it's very interesting. So again, what I want to point out there is something very interesting. Number one, the halacha is we don't sell behema gasa to an achri, right? Why not? Lest you come to rent them, and renting could be a problem. I still own it. The nachri is working it on Shabbos. What are the limitations of this? So again, Tanakama holds this includes all animals, whether they're healthy or maimed. Rabbi Yehuda says no. If it's maimed, you could sell it. Ben Beseira says an exception are horses. We'll say last part. Makum shenagu lechol tzli b'leilei Pesachim ochlin. Makum shenagu shelo lechol ein ochlin. We'll say a fascinating sugya. Eating roasted meat on the night of Pesach. Are you permitted to eat roasted meat on the night of Pesach? So Gemara says it was a din of minhag hamakom. So places where they ate roasted meat on Pesach, you could eat roasted meat. Places where they did not eat roasted meat, you should not eat roasted meat. Also, we're going to see this halacha l'maisa, which is really very interesting. What's the issue with eating roasted meat on the night of Pesach? Last Rashi in the Mishnah, 4 lines from the bottom, shlo lechol temechsi ka'ochel Pesach b'chutz. Because it has the appearance like you are eating the sacrificial lamb outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, we'll define the parameters here. Says the Gemara, will say, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rav, Asr lo li Adam, sheyomar basar ze lePesach. Both say a person should not say, this meat is for Pesach. Now both say, now bepashtos, a person is saying what? So Rashi points out this is even true if the animal is shechted already. So let's say, Erev Pesach, you say, this meat, this is for Pesach. A person shouldn't say that. Why? Because it has the appearance as if you're consecrating your animal and you're going to go ahead and consume a sacrificial animal ultimately outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So both say, we're very careful about how we go ahead and we talk about meat that you're going to eat. So both say, it could be, what I'm saying is I walk into the kitchen, my lamb is there, or my calf is there, and I say, this meat is for Pesach. Now, what do I mean? This is my dinner. I'm going to eat this tonight. So just don't use that verbiage, right? Don't use that lashon, because that lashon of basar zeh lePesach has the appearance that maybe in your mind you think you're offering up Karban Pesach outside of the Beis HaMikdash. We'll say, by the way, this is why during the Seder, when we get to Rabbi Gamliel, right? Rabbi Gamliel, Amar Kosh, Amar Shlosh Dvarim Ela B'Pesach V'Yosei Chavasan, the three, right? The most important part of the Seder, Pesach Matzah Maror. We point to Pesach, we point to Matzah, we point to Maror, but we do not point to Pesach, right? You do not point to the roasted shank bone or whatever you use for, to represent the. We don't point to it. Why? That's this Gemara. Because we don't go ahead and actively identify as anything as Pesach. Because the moment you do that, that has the appearance, ultimately again, of consumption of Karban Pesach outside of the vicinity of the Beis HaMikdash or of Yerushalayim, which of course is prohibited. Amra Papa, Dafka Basar. This Dafka refers to meat. Aval chiti lo deminter lepischa kamar. So ultimately, again, we'll say this only applies to meat. Meat, you can't say, this is for Pesach. But you can say it by wheat. Right? Why? Because we'll say, what happens if you say this wheat is for Pesach? Everyone understands that. What do you mean? What you mean to say is, you are guarding this wheat for the sake of Pesach. So the Gemara says, Ubasar lo, is that true? That you can't go ahead and say Basar Zula Pesach. When again, what I mean is, I don't mean this meat is for Karban Pesach. I mean this meat I'm going to consume on Pesach. But I said, this is incredible. Meisvei, Am Rabbi Yossi, Todus Isyu Romi, Hinhig Espenei Romi, Le'achol Gidiyim Mikulasin Balele Pesachim. Todus, right? Todus was an important man in Rome, a Jew, even though he had a Roman name. A Jew, and again we'll discuss about him in just a little bit. He instituted an interesting minhag in Rome. What was dinner in Rome on the night of Pesach? It was a fully intact lamb. Gadim mukulas literally means armored. We'll discuss this in a little bit. The way they used to roast the Karban Pesach was the animal was whole, and the kishkas, the inside of the animal, was roasted alongside the animal. Right, the animal itself was on a spit, and its feet and its kishkas, its insides, were roasted alongside. Todus instituted that's how they would. That was dinner Pesach night. So I will say, which looks a lot like what? Korban Pesach. A lot like. Forget about your shank bone. Todus is roasting, right? An open fire, a spit, a full lamb on a spit. That is Korban Pesach. But he's doing this in Rome. So the Gemara says, Sholchulo, and the Chachamim sent to him, El Molei Todus Ata, were it not that your Todus, Gazranu Alecha Nidui, we would excommunicate you. Sha'ata Machil Es Yisrael Kadshim Bachutz, because you are causing Klal Yisrael to eat karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Kadshim Sachadaytcha, come on. Even Todus wasn't saying that it was actual Korban Pesach. Ela'ima, rather what he means to say, Amid Beis, Ela'ima Karov Lahachil Es Yisrael Kadshim Bachutz. It looks like you're causing the Jewish people to eat karbanos outside of the Beis HaMikdash. So makulas in, shemikulas both say now in this case, why was it problematic? Because again, remember, both say this case it makes sense that it's problematic. I hear this because at the end of the day, the lamb is fully intact. It's on the spit, and l'maisa it looks like a korban Pesach. However, again, lo makulas. I'm sorry, she'in makulas lo. But from this you could see a piece of roasted meat, right? If I go ahead and I say, I'm going to eat this meat for Pesach, and it's just a piece of meat, not a fully intact lamb, that shouldn't be a problem. To which the Gemara says, here we go. Makulas loshna amar, loshna lo amar. The truth is, they're both saying, if you are roasting a fully intact lamb, that's problematic. Whether you make a declaration that this is for Pesach or not, it's problematic, just because the optics of it are not good. She'ina makulas, perish in, lo perish lo. If you don't have a fully intact lamb, but rather you just have a piece of meat, then it's only problematic if you say this meat is for Pesach. But if you don't say anything, then it's not problematic. So we'll see in the Shulchan Aruch, again, we're not going to do it today, we're going to do it tomorrow, Mir Hashem. We'll see in the Shulchan Aruch how exactly this plays out, but we know that there's a very strong minhag to avoid any type of roasted meat on the night of Pesach. Interesting discussion amongst the poskim about chicken, right? Because chicken, again, there are many who are makeled by chicken, that chicken is not a problem. It's really only meat, because Korban Pesach ultimately, but Amir Hashem, we'll see in the Shulchan Aruch. But you see this sensitivity of Chazal to avoiding anything which has the appearance ultimately, again, of offering up Korban Pesach outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Now watch this. So the Gemara says, Rav Acha masni l'hamasni sikrab Shimon. So Rav Acha, he went ahead and he quoted this story, this episode of Todus in the name of Rab Shimon. Maskif l'Rav Sheshes, Bishlam alaman detani ki Rabbi Yossi necha. Now the version we have has it in the name of Rabbi Yossi. So again, it's just saying who told over the story of Todus. So Rav Acha had in his version, in our Gemara, we had it as Rabbi Yossi saying it over. Rav Acha had it in the name of Rabbi Shimon. So Bishlam Rabbi Yossi Necha. So according to the opinion who said that it reflects the view of Rabbi, or it was said over the name Rabbi Yossi, makes sense. We'll see why in just a moment. Elo Lamanda Masna Rabbi Shimon Minecha. Rabbi say according to the version who has the story of Todus said over in the name of Rabbi Shimon doesn't make sense. Vatanan. Rabbi Shimon Poter, Shlois Nadiv Kiderach HaMisnadvim. The Rabbi says it's very interesting. What happens, very, very quickly, what happens if a person pledges a Korban Mincha from barley? From barley, right? So Rabbi say there is no such thing as a Korban Mincha from barley. Right? Korban Mincha only comes ultimately from wheat. From wheat. So Rabbi Shimon says that Allah Chalamayis, if a person goes ahead and pledges a Korban Mincha from barley, that statement is totally meaningless. Totally meaningless. Essentially, we'll say the Lashon the Gemara uses is Tafas Lashon Acharon. We grab the last piece of what he said. Since he said, Harei alai mincha min ha'sa'orim, we seize on sa'orim. There's no such thing as a mincha from sa'orim, and therefore his entire declaration is void. So Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi, uman demasni lo. So both say, so therefore again, using this logic, what Todus did was really inconsequential, because there's no such thing as a Korban Pesach outside of the Beis HaMikdash. To which the Gemara says, Amar Ravina Rav Ashi, Uman demasla Rabbi Yossi minecha, v'amar Rava Rabbi Shimon b'shitas Rabbi Yossi amra. But yet Rava said that Rabbi Shimon himself held like Rabbi Yossi, which sounds like Rabbi Yossi would also say it's an inconsequential statement. The Gemara says, the Amar af b'gemar dvarav Adam nitva. So we'll say, we've seen this machlokes before in general. When a person says something, there's two parts of the statement. One part is coherent, the second part is incoherent. Or one part is true, the second part is false. Which part do we accept? So we'll say, for example, if a person says, Harei alai mincha min ha-sa'orim. If I say, I hereby accept upon myself, I'm doing a mincha from barley. There are two parts to that statement. Part one is I accept upon myself mincha. Part two is it's from barley. So we'll say, which part of the lashon do you go ahead and accept? Say if you accept the first part, he's chayv mincha. And where does he bring that mincha from? He brings the mincha from chitin. But if you accept the second part, then what? Min ha-sa'orim, then ultimately the statement is inconsequential. So Rabbi Shimon is the one who says, Tafus lashon achron. But Rabbi Shimon gets a shita from Rabbi Yossi. My love means Rabbi Shimon is something like Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi not something like Rabbi Shimon. Now, if Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Yossi, does Rabbi Yossi not hold like Rabbi Shimon? To which the Gemara says, Lo, Rabbi Shimon something like Rabbi Yossi, v'lo Rabbi Yossi something like Rabbi Shimon. No, the Gemara says, you have to say that what? Rabbi Yossi holds. I'm sorry. Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Yossi, but Rabbi Yossi does not hold like Rabbi Shimon. Okay, Bari Lahu. So we'll say, now let's go weiter. Say Bari Lahu. So we'll say, so just a machlokes as to who said over the story of Todus. But we'll say one more important piece. Bari Lahu. Todus Ishromi, Gavra Rabahava, or Bal Egrofin Hava. We'll say, watch this story. See, I'll say, the story with Todus is very interesting. Why? Because the rabbis sent a message to Todus. And they said to Todus, if you were not Todus, we would excommunicate you. So what does that mean, Abosai? Does that mean, was Todus a big tzaddik? Or maybe he just wasn't a big tzaddik, he was just very powerful. So the rabbis, were they saying Todus, because you're such a great tzaddik, we're not going to excommunicate you? Or were they saying Todus, because you're pretty powerful, that's how we're not going to excommunicate you? So I'll say, listen to this. So Gavra Rabba, was he a great man? Or Bala Grofin? I'll say, Bala Grofin means what? A man of fists. So he was powerful, they were afraid of him. So we'll say, watch this, Tashma. Od zed darish Todus ishromi. We'll say, Todus also darshan in the following. We'll say, the question is answered right here. The fact that Todus is Torah is recorded in the Gemara tells us that what? He was a great man. That's why they wouldn't excommunicate him. It wasn't because he was powerful and they were afraid. It was because he was a great Talmud Chacham, and so they did not want to excommunicate him. It goes back to yesterday's daf, because when you excommunicate the Talmud Chacham, you also go ahead and tarnish Kavarat Torah. So we'll say, watch this, but this will end. This is beautiful. Ma ra'u Chananya Mishal va'Azariah shemasru nafsham al kedushas Hashem nekiv shana ish. I will say, why did Chananya, Mishal, and Azariah allow themselves to be thrown into the fiery furnace? We'll say just a bit of context, very, very quickly. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Bavel, had built a great statue of himself. Everyone had to bow down to it. Chananya, Mishael, and Azariah would not bow down to it. They were threatened with death, and they sooner accepted death than to bow down to the statue. There's a lot of discussion in Rashi and Tosis about, was this Avodah Zarah, was this not Avodah Zarah? So why did Chananya, Mishael, and Azariah allow themselves to be thrown into the fiery furnace rather than bow down? So both say, Tosis understands that Nebuchadnezzar did not build this statue as Avodah Zarah. It wasn't idolatry. So why did he want people to bow down to it? Bowing down to it was a sign of allegiance to the king. As such, on a technical level, if it's not idolatry, you could bow down to it. You could bow down to it. So why did Chananya ben Mishael v'Azariah not bow down? Why did they allow themselves to be thrown into the fire furnace? We'll say this is incredible. The Gemara says, Nasu kal v'chomer be'atzman. They made a kal v'chomer. Mitzvardim, we'll say this week's parsha, the second makkah of frogs. Umatzvardim shem mitzuvah kedushas Hashem kas ksiv b'hu ubaba v'secha b'tarach m'sharasecha. Right, by the frogs, we'll say, what does the pasuk say? The pasuk says the frogs are going to come everywhere. They're going to come in your house and in your ovens and in your mixing bowls. Emasei misharos mitzuyos eitzel tanor. When are the mixing bowls next to the oven? Havi omer b'shasha tanor cham. Only when the oven is hot. In other words, if you're baking, you heat up your oven while you're kneading in the bowls, which means that when the frogs jumped into everything, what did they jump into? What they jumped into hot ovens. They gave their lives al kiddush Hashem. Anu, listen to this. Havi anu mitzuvin al kiddush Hashem alachas kama v'kama. If the frogs were willing to give their lives al kiddush Hashem, and they are not commanded al kiddush Hashem, then then Allah has kama v'kama said Chananya, Mishael, v'Azariah, we have to give our lives. I will say, isn't that incredible? They learned out the need to give their lives, mamish, from Tzadei. Allah Rabbi Yosef Avin Amar Matimele case Shatam. Sorry, well, fine. Let me just finish this up very quickly. So Rabbi Yossi Bar Avin says Matimele case Shatamidi Cham Haya. That Todos, Rabbi say, was not only about tzedakah, but you know what he used to do? He used to put merchandise in the pockets of the Talmidei Chachamim so that they could sell the merchandise and make a parnasa. Then Rabbi Yochanan, Kalamatil Melei Lekis Talmidei Chachamim Zocha V'Yoshe B'Yeshiva Shamala. We'll say, if you help a Talmid Chacham make parnasa, you have a special seat in the Yeshiva Shamala. Shneimar Ki Betzela Chachma Betzela Kesef. Those who sit in the shade of Chachma, the shade of money. We'll say an incredible yisod. We'll stop over here, but the yisod ultimately being that Todus. So we'll say, see two examples of how Todus was a great tzaddik. Number one, because he darshan Torah, his teachings are included. And number two is that he gave the Talmidei Chachamim merchandise with which to make a parnas. All right, we'll say, we'll stop here. Much more to say about this. We'll pick up a Mirat Hashem here tomorrow. Shkach, we'll say.
111.